What's next for Syria? Hopes for a truce are fading as hostilities grow. Also on today's program, Bosnia-Herzegovina applies for EU membership, but is it ready to join the club? And in Picture This, the Pope hits out at Mexico's drug traders, calling them dealers of death. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. Last week, world leaders gathered in Munich and agreed to cease hostilities in Syria. That agreement and the optimism that came with it is all but dead. 2 hospitals in northern Syria have been hit by airstrikes, killing at least 23 people. Syrian regime forces are tightening their grip on Aleppo in an offensive that has displaced tens of thousands of people. Last weekend, Turkey began shelling Kurdish YPG positions in northern Syria in response to their attacks on the town of Azaz. Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu says Ankara will keep retaliating against the YPG, who are linked to the PKK terror group, until it stops its assault on the town. Meanwhile, Saudi fighter jets have been deployed to Turkey's Incirlik airbase. The Gulf state has said it would be prepared to send ground troops to Syria. Russia warns any foreign troops entering the conflict could start a world war. Today's newsmaker is the war in Syria. As the conflict grows ever more complex and hopes for peace grow ever more distant.
Syria's war grows increasingly complex as different players with different interests all try to make their mark on the drawn-out war. The Turkish army has been firing artillery across the border into northern Syria, targeting the Kurdish YPG. The Syrian regime accuses Turkey of violating its sovereignty, but Turkey says it's defending itself.
We want the whole world to know that the YPG will get our toughest response if they get any closer. We will also not allow the airbase in Azaz to be used against Turkey or the moderate opposition. And, if they insist, we will render it unoperational. I also said this to the Vice President of the US, Joe Biden.
The Kurdish YPG controls most of Syria's northern border with Turkey. The US considers the YPG an ally in the fight against Daesh. But the YPG is also fighting rebel groups in northern Syria. The YPG is linked to the PKK, a terror group based in southeastern Turkey that has fought the Turkish state for decades. And Ankara wants to prevent the YPG from creating a northern corridor. The YPG recently took over an airbase near the town of Azaz with help from Russian airstrikes. While that goes on, Saudi Arabia has sent 4 fighter jets to Turkey's Incirlik airbase. Saudi has said it will consider sending ground troops into Syria, but Turkey has promised it won't. Efforts to end the war are already fragile. In Munich, world powers agreed a cessation of hostilities should begin this week. But Russia says it will continue with some airstrikes, which have swung momentum in favor of Bashar al-Assad. His forces have been making gains in the rebel stronghold of Aleppo. Control of the city offers a strategic edge, both militarily and diplomatically. And so the fight for Aleppo remains one of the biggest obstacles to peace. Most of Aleppo has been in the hands of various rebel groups for 4 years. It's become a symbol of the resistance. Syrian regime forces, backed by Russian air power, are cutting supply lines, including humanitarian aid. Russia insists it's targeting terrorists, not civilians. But the Syrian regime's push towards Aleppo has displaced tens of thousands of people who've headed for the Turkish border. Those who remain are simply trying to survive, while world leaders mull their next move in Syria. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss the latest developments in Syria's war is Robin Yassin Kassab, a British Syrian writer and the co-author of Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War. He's in Carlisle in the UK. And in London is Ammar Waqaf. He's the founder and director of Gnosis, an organization that provides stakeholder opinion on Syria and the Middle East. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Robin, let's start with you.
Thank you.
Was Munich a waste of time?
Yes, absolutely, it was a waste of time. It was worse than a waste of time. Munich in 2016 is very reminiscent of Munich in 1938. Of course, throughout the 1930s, European powers were appeasing Hitler as he continued to grow and to expand until by 1939 we got to a point where the choice was total surrender or total war. So it was worse than a waste of time. It was another sad stage on the path of appeasement. This war is still escalating, and until we can get some serious recognition that this so-called peace process isn't a peace process, then we're not going to be able to start dealing with the causes of it.
Okay, Ammar Wakaf, you've got Russian help. Are you confident that the Assad government is going to reclaim most of the country in the not-too-distant future, Ammar?
It may take some time. We need to understand that the Syrian government's position is all about asserting its own legitimacy over the entire country. Currently, as we speak, there is a drive into the Raqqa province, which is the only province in Syria where the Syrian government doesn't have any troops on the ground or any presence of whatsoever. There is a spearhead going in near Tabqa, and it's just about the Syrian government expressing its own sovereignty, or whatever it is, on every single area in Syria, no matter how much land it has lost. And this is very important, we believe, because the Syrian government, if it doesn't do that and revert to something like useful Syria or Western Syria, then it would lose a lot of legitimacy from its own constituents, so to speak.
Robin, Ammar believes that the Assad regime still has legitimacy.
Well, it's obviously absurd. It's very strange to hear him, well, it's not strange to hear him saying that. I expected him to say that. It's obviously absurd. This is the regime which has killed the vast majority, as you've said rightly, of probably more like 500,000 people dead now. There are 12 million people who have been driven from their homes, the vast majority of them by the Assad regime and now by Russian bombing. In 2011, a popular protest movement was met by, which was calling for reform at the time, not for revolution, which of course it's true, it didn't involve the whole Syrian population, but it involved huge swathes of Syrians from various sects and backgrounds. At the same time, the regime released 1,500 Salafist jihadist terrorists from prison. It deliberately started this war. It's bombed. It's the only force, until Russia came in, it was the only power in the country with an air force. It's bombed every city in the country, every major city in the country except one. It's reduced Homs and Aleppo, the second and third largest cities in the country, to rubble. And then here's this guy talking about sovereignty. But unfortunately, if Syrians are going to have a chance to define what Syria is, as Ammar says, we have to get rid of this regime, stop the bombing, allow the refugees to come back, allow the democratic councils which have been set up to be heard, and then have a national conversation without one side bombing the hell out of the other.
Okay, let's get a response from Ammar. Ammar, to add to that, I mean, Robin talks about this being an imperial operation or an imperial defense. US Senator John McCain, the chairman of the US Senate's Armed Services Committee, said just yesterday that Putin wants to use Syria as a live-fire exercise for Russia's modernizing military. He wants to turn Latakia province into a military outpost from which to harden and enforce a Russian sphere of influence, a new Kaliningrad or Crimea. These men are making a strong case, aren't they?
Well, first of all, I need to go back to what Robin said. If there are enough Syrians on the ground who are mounting the governmental institutions day in, day out with their feet, if 2 out of every 3 people who desert the fighting areas choose to go into the government-controlled areas rather than to go to the likes of Turkey or Lebanon and Jordan, then the government can feel that it has enough support on the ground, and that's all the legitimacy it needs. That's one. Second, I don't buy into the regime actually being so brutal with the protesters. There was a small research that I did before, a few years back, And actually, the civilian deaths in Syria in the first 3 weeks, and the first 3 weeks is when the first organized armed assault on an army convoy in Banias took place. The civilian dead at the time in Syria was less than the civilian dead in 3 weeks in Tunisia, and obviously at least 1/3 of that in Egypt. So there isn't much evidence to suggest that the Syrian regime met the peaceful demonstrators with more force than other regimes in the region. But going back to the Russian influence, that's fine. I think at the end of the day, Syria cannot survive on its own with regards to keeping up external foes. We believe in the organization that at the end of the day, when Russia came, the primary objective of the Russian interference or intervention in Syria, which started at the 30th of September, was to fend off a possible Turkish incursion and in order to create the safe zone unilaterally. And so it was to bring about some sort of defense against foreign forces rather than to shore up the regime. Obviously, that's a second, probably highly desirable
And allow me to interrupt you there just for a
objective.
second. The Turkish Defense Minister, İsmet Yılmaz, said categorically that Turkey had no intention to send Turkish soldiers to Syria. Robin, let's get a response from you, and let me frame it this way. Let me frame it to this way, Robin. How do those groups and countries opposed to Assad roll back the gains made by Assad and the Russians over the past couple months without going to war with Moscow and without risking a possible World War III?
First, if I may, I'd like to go back to this disgusting argument that Ammar is using, that the civilians who are being driven from their homes by barrel bombs and chlorine gas. I'm sorry, what you're saying is not civilized, and you know it's not civilized. You're insulting your countrymen who are suffering so much. It's true that a lot of people who leave the areas which are being so horrifically bombed by the regime, if they are not young men or people whose names are on lists, then they go to regime-controlled areas. This doesn't mean that they love the regime. This means because the Russians and Assad are not dropping bombs on the regime-controlled areas. And why do they not go to Turkey or Lebanon? Because the borders are often closed. The Lebanese are no longer accepting people because more than a quarter of the Lebanese population are now Syrians who've been driven out of Syria by your sovereign leader. So this is just absurd and disgusting that you're trying to say that refugees leaving their homes and being driven into areas which are not being bombed are therefore expressing their love for the regime which is bombing their homes. That's just disgusting, Ammar, and you know it is, and I wish you'd stop using such disgusting existence.
Okay, Robin, let's move on from that, Robin. Yes, to answer my question, Robin.
As for your propaganda about how the regime was no worse than other regimes in the area, that may be true in the first 3 weeks. That it was no worse than the Egyptian tyranny, which was murdering people, or the Tunisian tyranny that was murdering people. Well done, congratulations. But the United Nations Human Rights Council has just released a very comprehensive report which accuses it doesn't accuse, it gives evidence of the regime being guilty of crimes against humanity and war crimes, including the crime of extermination, including sexual crimes and torture. This is a regime which has committed a vast rape campaign. It's got the army raping children in front of parents and parents in front of children. All of this has been documented again and again and again by United Nations bodies, international states, international human rights organisations. And it's sad that you bring, instead of an analyst, a propagandist onto TV just to repeat things that everybody knows aren't true.
If you'd allow me to get your response to my question, how do those opposed to Assad and Putin right now in Syria to try to roll back their gains that they made over the past couple of months, how do those opposed to them do that without going to war with Moscow and possibly risking a world war? How does that happen?
Well, I think that, as we said earlier, Munich 2016 is Munich 1938. So the Russians keep shouting about Third World War, even though it's them that keep escalating. They're doing this because they know that the man in the White House is appeasing them, as Hitler was appeased in the 30s. I think that Russia needs to be stood up to over Ukraine as well as Syria. And I think that the European Union should recognize that Moscow is attacking Europe through Syria. It's driving hundreds of thousands more refugees out of the country. Those people are coming to Europe. A lot of those people are going to come to Europe. This year, the Schengen zone in the European Union will probably collapse. The borders will go back up as a result. Putin is doing this deliberately. He's got a large game. So I think there should be much stronger and total sanctions on Putin for the sake of Europe as well as for the sake of the Middle East. And I welcome Turkey's action at the moment. I must say that I think that the bad blood between Turks and Kurds is a tragedy for both peoples, which really needs to be seriously addressed inside Turkey in an equal and mutually respectful manner. In Syria, the PYD, which is the PKK, I think that the Kurds have the right to choose their own representatives. They have the right to self-determination in areas where they are a majority. So in the areas where they are a majority, like Afrin, they have a right to autonomy to control their own areas. But they do not have a right, under Russian bombs, to move into Arab majority towns and occupy them as part of the plan with the Iranian militias and the Assad forces and the Russian bombs to encircle rebel-held Idlib and Aleppo provinces. So I'm glad the Turks are coming in. I hope they do much more, and I hope they give anti-aircraft missiles to the democratic communities that are still surviving in places like Aleppo to help those communities defend themselves so that they can survive, so that in this national liberation war that's coming, it isn't just the jihadists that are standing against fascism and imperialism, but we have the Democrats who've done such great work too.
Strongly put, Robin. Ammar, we are running out of time, so I want to get some final thoughts from you, Ammar, please.
Thank you. Well, first of all, using bad language and foul language isn't going to intimidate anyone. I didn't use bad language.
You used grotesque and disgusting propaganda. It's a shame that people invite you on TV to repeat this nonsense.
Okay, Robin, let's give Ammar a chance.
You just can't say things which aren't true. You can give your point of view, but don't lie. Sorry, over to you. Okay. Over to your lies and propaganda.
Go for it, Ammar.
Well, I mean, intimidating the other guest isn't about a discussion. It's about imposing your own idea. Let us go back to why there are a lot of Syrians who decided from the very first moment in time that this revolution isn't going to bring them anything but destruction. It is because the main idea behind the revolution is to turn Syria from the current state as it is into a state like Lebanon or Iraq, whereby people decided by the color of their skins can be first-degree or second-degree citizens. That's the key issue in Syria.
Now that's the way it was before the revolution. That's why there was a revolution, Ammar.
No, dream on, dream on. We know who is fighting on the ground, and they're not hiding themselves, Robin.
Do you? Really Turn on the TV and look at the destroyed cities.
Ammar and Robin, I'm going to have to stop both of you because we have run out of time.
Refugees next to you in London who've escaped from your murdering regime.
Ammar and Robin, the satellite feed's going to drop off for both of you, so I'm going to have to stop both of you right now because we have run out of time. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, why Bosnia's road to the EU remains a long one. And in Picture This, Pope Francis warns Mexico City residents against dialogue with the devil. Bosnia and Herzegovina is submitting an application to join the European Union. It's a major milestone in the country's integration into Europe, 20 years after the end of a war that killed 100,000 people. But some question whether the Balkan state has reformed enough to apply to the 28-member bloc. Yvette McCullough takes a look at Bosnia-Herzegovina's economic and political situation.
Bosnia and Herzegovina's membership request now means that Kosovo is the only Western Balkan state that hasn't applied to join the EU. In order to join, countries must prove they have stable institutions that guarantee democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and respect for and protection of minorities. They must also have a functioning market economy and be able to cope with competition. Bosnia and Herzegovina has one of the most complex government systems in the world, a legacy of the Dayton Agreement that ended the war. The country is split into two entities. 51% is known as the Federation, which is made up of mostly Bosniaks and Croats, and 49% is Republika Srpska, made up of mostly Orthodox Serbs. There's also a third self-governing administration. The country has a three-pronged presidency and an international peacekeeping body, the Office of the High Representative. Government positions are allocated by ethnicity, so if you aren't Bosniak, Serb or Croat, you cannot run for office. In 2009, the European Court of Human Rights ruled this was discriminatory and needed to change. But in 2014, the UK and Germany launched an initiative to encourage economic development and reform, and the ethnic requirements for candidates were maintained. Critics say Bosnia and Herzegovina isn't ready to apply for EU membership. In 2014, violent protests broke out across the country over poor living standards, unemployment, and ineffective government. Unemployment among young people is one of the highest in the world. In 2014, it was 57%. Bosnia and Herzegovina is 76th out of 168 countries on Transparency International's Corruption Index. And the political situation is delicate, with the leader of Republika Srpska seeking a referendum on independence. The European Commission has said it will give more than $1 billion to support reforms over the next 3 years. And Bosnia and Herzegovina is hopeful the EU will grant the country candidacy status by 2017. Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now is Jessie Ronishova. She's an expert in Bosnian politics at the University of Oxford. Thanks a lot for joining us, Ms. Ronishova. Why aren't you in support of EU membership for Bosnia-Herzegovina?
I am absolutely for EU membership of Bosnia and Herzegovina. That is not the question, and that is not what I have been arguing against. What I have been saying is that this application, which was submitted today, was submitted by a country which is simply not ready, and the reason why it was submitted was to legitimize the elites that submitted the application rather than to show that the country is actually ready. So although I am all for Bosnia and Herzegovina to join the European Union, I think it should join it as a country that is ready, that has fulfilled the conditions, and that has reformed, and that has not been the case of the country. And I think it's a failure of the side of the European Union to keep lying to itself that Bosnia has made significant progress in the past few years, which is simply not the case.
Well, if this could take a decade, why don't you cut them some slack? I mean, wouldn't this force the government to get serious about unemployment, to get serious about poverty, about corruption, about providing basic services? Wouldn't that EU membership as a dangling carrot be a good thing?
It would, but if we look around the region and if we look at countries that joined the European Union or that were given the candidate status, such as Macedonia or Bulgaria, which already is in the European Union, you can see that the EU leverage, as we call it, is extremely inconsistent, but it gets higher before the actual accession. In the case of Bosnia, though, the case is slightly different because the country is going through a different type of reforms than the other countries in the region. You mentioned the British-German initiative from 2014, which basically created a set of reforms that Bosnia should have been adopting. And the way that these reforms have been adopted in Bosnia were in a way of a Potemkin type of reformization. When these reforms are adopted on the paper, sometimes they're not discussed. More often than not, they're not discussed in a public debate, and they're certainly not implemented. And so you actually cannot argue that in the case of Bosnia, you would see this leverage happening once Bosnia submits the application, which was the case today. And we must not forget that the local elections are going to happen in the country in October 2016, this year. And one of those people that actually submitted the application today, the president of the presidency, Dragan Čović, is pretty much using the submission of the application as his pre-electoral campaign.
Jessie Ronishova, thank you very much for joining us. In today's Picture This, Pope Francis is touring Mexico, where he's been addressing Mexico's growing drug violence in some of its poorest regions. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker has been the war in Syria. Earlier this month, talks in Geneva aimed at ending the war were suspended just days after they began. World leaders then gathered in Munich, where they loosely agreed on a cessation of hostilities. But now even that looks to be in jeopardy. Russia has continued its aerial bombardment, backing regime forces. Now Saudi Arabia is the latest player to position warplanes on the conflict's front line. And Turkey's shelling of YPG positions will continue so long as the militants threaten the border town of Azaz. As the diplomatic and military positioning continues, Syria's already protracted war looks set to become even more complicated. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. As always, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.